Shirt is almost finished. I've got the hems in the sleeve, the hem in the bottom, and it's looking really good. The next thing is button placement. Now, if you remember back when we did the collar and the lapel, we understitched the lapel and we stopped right here. And then we understitched the front facing to right here. So we have a gap between here and here. This is where our first button placement is going to go. So I'm just going to put a pin in here for now to mark the very center of my button. And I want to make sure that I'm at least a ½ inch away from the edge. So my outside buttonhole is going to be a ½ inch out, and the inside is going to be about 3/4 of an inch away from the edge, roughly. So my first button will sit like this. So my first button is going to sit right in between the area where it's understitched for my lapel and it's understitched for my front facing. This area is known as the break. This is where the first top button is going to go, right in that area. And I want to keep the button spaced away from the edge at least 1/4 of an inch, which means the center of my buttonhole will be about a ½ to 5/8 of an inch from that edge. And I've marked it the center of my button with a pin. And then I'm going to come down to the bottom and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to come to the bottom and do the same thing, noting that I want my slit to be approximately the height of my bottom button. I don't want it below the slit opening, so I want to stay at least to that edge, if not slightly higher. So that means that my slit is 3½ inches high, so my last button needs to be at least 3½ inches high. I'm going to go for about 4 and have it slightly above the slit. So right here I'm going to put another pin horizontally to mark the center of my button. So this would be the center of my button here. The next thing I want to do is decide how many buttons I want in between the top button and the bottom button. I've decided on 6 total buttons. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that means 4 will go in the middle here. Now this is difficult to figure this out in the middle. You can measure from here to here and then divide it into spaces, not buttons, but spaces. So you'd have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spaces. So whatever this is divided by 5, and that would be how many inches would be in between each button. This is called an expanding sewing gauge. And as you can see, it takes all the guesswork out of this. I can place my top edge of my sewing gauge where I want my top button, and then I know I want 4 buttons in between, 1, 2, 3, 4. So my bottom button will line up here. That gives me 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Takes all the guesswork out. I don't have to calculate, I don't have to measure. I just simply put this here and then put my pins in where I want my buttons to be. Now, you start by marking the center of your button. That's the most important part. And then we'll calculate where the buttonholes go and all the other stuff around that. Now, my shirt, I'm doing it with wearers right over left. Now, shirts for women are commonly right over left. That being said, many times you can get a woman's shirt that's left over right, especially if it's cut with a menswear design. Menswear is always left over right. You don't ever make a man's shirt and put right over left. They don't have the luxury of going back and forth like the women do. So left over right for men, right over left for women is the most common way that you lap a shirt. So mine is right over left, and I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 marked out with my expanding sewing gauge. And I highly recommend it. So now that we have our buttons marked on the right side, I want to take my 2 edges and I'm going to put them together like this, making sure I have the hem and the lapel corner matching. Now, hopefully you checked that while you were sewing and they should be even length. And I'm going to go along here and I'm going to transfer this information to the other side of my shirt, the left side, because one side will be buttonholes and one side will be the buttons. So now I've pinned both sides where my buttons and buttonholes are going to go. So we're going to peel back the side with the buttons and just look at it in a moment. Now we want to look at the buttonhole side. So we're going to revisit this stitch gauge, and what I want to do is go from my top button, where my top button is going to be, and if you notice on here, there is inches. There's a quarter, a half, 3/4, and so forth. So I want my buttonhole to be a 1/2 inch from the edge of my shirt. Actually, just a little bit more, about 5/8. So what I'm going to do is take a little fabric marker and I'm going to make a little dot so that I know my buttonholes are lined up in the proper distance from the edge of my fabric as well as the distance in between the buttons. I now have red marks, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 marks on my shirt where I'm going to put my buttonholes. Now this is the dead center of my buttonhole, so I know my buttonhole is going to be a 1/2 inch. So I'm going to mark it 1/4 inch above and below all of these little points that I've drawn in red. So now I have my actual buttonholes marked, 1/2 inch total, 1/4 inch below and above the mark where my button will go, and evenly spaced from the edge, 5/8 of an inch. So this way my button will be in perfect alignment from the edge and the space in between. Now on the other side, I've taken the gauge and I've put the gauge here, again, 5/8 inch from the edge, and I've marked all of my button placement by just taking the edge of my expanding sewing gauge and just taking my marker, my fabric marker, and just twisting until I've made a dot where every button is going to be placed here. And now I know where to sew my buttons on too. So let's go to the sewing machine and I will start showing you how to sew the buttons. So let's talk about buttonholes and placement and why we do certain things. The buttons on my shirt are parallel to the edge here. The reason being, I don't want to run them perpendicular because that would be like a jacket. The reason a jacket is run perpendicular is to give you more play and flexibility because it's an outerwear garment and it needs a little more movement room. For a shirt, you don't want to do that because then you could compromise the edge of your shirt and end up with bumps out here where the buttons holes are. So this is going to run parallel and make a nice clean finish. Jackets go perpendicular to give room for movement. So let's go over to the sewing machine and I'll show you how to make the buttonholes. Now we're ready to put the buttonholes on our shirt. Now there's 2 ways you can do it. You can make manual buttonholes, and I have a video in my channel about how to make a manual buttonhole. Or if you have a foot attachment, you can do it with the foot attachment. Now some machines will have it built in and you don't need this apparatus for your foot attachment. You can use a regular foot that looks much like your regular foot to sew your buttonholes. So what happens here with this foot, you're going to drop the button in the back and press down on the gauge to make sure it's in there firmly. And that's going to make the right size buttonhole that fits this button. So here's the diagram for the buttonholes, and I'm going to use number 30. So you can see you have a variety of buttonholes on whatever machine you have. You should have several of those, and that's something if you're in the market for buying a machine that you need to look for. So I've got mine set on 30, and it automatically will set the stitch width and length that I need to make my buttonhole. First thing I'm going to do is release the regular foot that I usually use and put it aside, and then put the bar, the pin, right under the placement here and drop my foot down on it so that it will connect with this foot. Once it connects and you lift up on the foot will come with it. That way you'll know you're in the right place. Keep your threads off to the side like this. Don't worry about trying to get them underneath the foot. Just keep them to the side. And then we're going to make a practice buttonhole. Now I'm just going to do it randomly. I want my buttonhole to line up with the bottom edge of my line on my shirt because it's going to go backwards first. So once I have it all set up, I drop down this little bar right here. That goes between the depth of my buttonhole and tells it when to stop and turn and go the other way. So here we go. You really don't have to do anything, just have your hands there in case it goes awry, but it pretty much does everything by itself. When it's done, the needle will move very slow up and down in one single place, and that way you'll know. Sometimes you'll have a buttonhole that will actually have a red light that tells you it's done. Lift up your foot, pull your thread carrier to the top, and you pull it out and see you've got a lovely little buttonhole. It's preferred to do your samples on the fabric you're going to use so that it's like kinds. I did this so you could actually see it on the contrast of black background with a white button. So now I'm going to start putting my buttons onto my shirt. So I'm going to start at the bottom of my buttonhole, and I'm going to take this point right here and I'm going to line it up in this little view, little rectangular view part right there. The red lines are what I'm going to line up the bottom of my buttonhole line with. So I'm going to find the point and make sure that I'm parallel to the edge of my fabric. Don't focus on this and get it crooked. So you want to make sure that your fabric is parallel out here. Now it's ready to make the buttonhole. Now once you have your buttonhole made, your first one, and note I started at the bottom of my shirt because it works backwards. I can simply lift the foot up, slide up to my next buttonhole, not have to trim my threads, and put that buttonhole in the proper place, and I'm ready to go again. So I can go all the way up my shirt like this, making buttonholes and just not cutting the thread in between. I don't even cut them open yet. I wait till I sew my buttons on and then I'll cut my buttonholes open. So let me finish all my buttonholes and then we'll talk about how to sew the buttons on. Now it's time to sew our buttons on, and I want to show you how to do it with the machine. Of course, you can always sew it on by hand. Now, the first thing you want to do is set your settings on a zigzag setting, and then you want to make sure your feed dogs, the rough, rigidy things underneath your foot, are in the down position. You don't want them moving because that's very important that they do not creep while you're doing this. So the feed dogs are down, and then you take your button and you're going to line it up on your red dot. Now, when you're sewing buttons on and the buttonholes are going in a certain direction, you want the buttonholes on a two-button button to go in the same direction. That way it won't influence the button itself. And then you put it on zigzag and you line the needle up. If it's in the outside position, you line it up with the outside buttonhole. And then put your foot down gently. And the first thing you want to do is hand crank this until, just turn the wheel toward you until you can see that your buttonhole, your needle's going to line up with the holes in your button. You don't want them scraping the edge. See how that one's kind of scraping the edge? So I'm going to turn it down just a little bit. I'm going to hand crank it again and see that it lines up comfortably in both holes. Once you have that, just gently put it on slow and gently just sew back and forth. It's not going to move because the feed dogs are down. Once you've done this about 5 or 6 times, line it up with one of the holes. Lift your pressure foot up and put the width on 0. And then gently raise the needle out of the fabric and then reposition it in the hole that you just had it in, and go up and down about 3 or 4 times here. This will tie a knot and let your button stay securely on your fabric. See? And there is how you sew a button on with your machine. So now it's time to cut open our buttonholes. And I highly recommend you don't use a seam ripper. Use a very sharp tip pair of little scissors, a buttonhole snippers or very tiny detail scissors with good sharp points. And you're going to fold your buttonhole in half, making sure you line the two edges up against each other and make a tiny snip right in the middle of the buttonhole. You don't want to go cut the whole thing, just a little snip, big enough to get the point of your scissors in there. And you go up just to the edge of the end of your buttonhole, and then you do the same over here. Go just to the edge of your buttonhole. And that's how you cut it open. So be careful when you do it. You don't want to do all that beautiful work and then ruin it cutting it open. So I'm going to press the shirt, put it on the form, and we're going to take a look at the finished product. So my shirt is finished, and I really like it. It's got a little bit of an A shape to it, so it's going to fit really nice and be comfortable. I love the way the pattern complements the buttons. This is the front view. Now we'll look at the back view. Wear it. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you enjoy making shirts, and I'll see you in the next video.